Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. Today's video is all about this year's Christmas project. I did make one this year, it just took me a long time to finish because it was very complicated. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is my most complicated Christmas costume ever. And I think because of that, it's one of my favorites because you see all of the skills I've accumulated over the years of making these in this one project. It's both historical and festive and fantastical, and I really like that combination of things. I think this was especially influenced by last year's Christmas costume where I made myself look like a tree. I worked with pine garlands and mounted them on a hoop skirt to create both the silhouette and appearance of a tree. A literal tree skirt, if you will. Now in making last year's project, I realized two things. One, I mainly make these costumes because I just like buying Christmas decorations. And number two, you need a pretty structured silhouette to support the weight of all of those decorations. That led me to the idea of bustle dresses because unlike an elliptical hoop skirt, the bustle is supported by the back of your body. It sits against your body and flares out from there, as opposed to sort of hanging out in space where it has more opportunity to collapse. So I thought a bustle dress was a good idea for this, and there's also a fashion plate of this floral bustle dress that I have adored for years. I thought it'd be really fun to make out of Christmas materials and have it look like a garland was just wrapping around the dress, and it would sort of be an elevated version of what I made last year. With that decided, I went out to buy the decorations for this, and I couldn't find any garlands that were quite what I wanted. I wanted something that was really floral, and most of them were just branches. So I ended up actually buying these chain link floral garlands and then twining pine branches through them and then adding a whole bunch of ornaments and stuff to make them look fancier. And this ended up being the far cheaper option, but it was also far more time consuming. I had to decorate, I think, 5 6-foot lengths of these garlands for the skirt. I actually started on the skirt of this project first because that was the main unknown factor for me and it was what I wanted to get out of the way. But for the sake of this video, I think it makes more sense to take you through the bodice construction first, so that's what I'm gonna do. I drafted the pattern for this off camera, but here you can see me tracing it onto 2 layers of cotton as well as a cotton interlining, which is sort of a canvasy feeling lightweight material that's going to prevent the cotton layers from stretching. One of these cotton layers is going to be used for lining and the other is going to be used for flat lining underneath the fashion fabric, which is sheer. I just weighted the pattern pieces down and traced around them as opposed to pinning them because it's a little bit faster and I find it actually distorts the pattern paper less. And then I pinned together all of the layers of fabric and cut around that outline. I unfortunately neglected to iron my cotton layers before I did this, not sure why, but that meant that I had to go back through and unpin them and press all of those cotton pieces before matching them up with their cotton interlining counterparts. So one layer of the red cotton was matched up with the canvasy interlining. And if the edges were uneven, then I would trim the cotton layer to match the interlining because the interlining was nice and smooth before I cut it where the cotton was not. And the cotton I'm using for this is just a quilting cotton that I got from Joann's for about $4 a yard. However, the overlay fabric I'm using is a little bit more elaborate. So this is an absolutely beautiful silk chiffon, and it is a metallic silk chiffon that has metallic fibers woven through it, so it just shines in the sunlight. It's so, so pretty. And I had 8 yards of it, and I used pretty much all of it for this project. That was another reason I wanted to make the skirt first, because I wasn't really sure how much I would have left over to then sacrifice to the bodice design, which is part of the reason I ended up going with a very simple waist-length bodice. But anyway, these pieces were pinned so the right sides were facing outward, and then I just roughly cut around them. The silk chiffon shifts a lot, so I didn't want to cut these to the exact right size and then potentially have edges not line up after basting them together. So instead I cut them to be oversized, then took everything over to the machine, basted around the edges of the interlining, and then I could trim the excess chiffon away from the edges. I also deeply apologize for the fact that one of my dogs is over here licking herself and the other dog is over here chewing on a bone. That's probably really annoying, but it's like the least annoying thing they could be doing right now other than sleeping, and they really don't want to be sleeping, which is stupid because I'm filming this at 6 in the morning. Yeah, I procrastinated that hard that I not only didn't play World of Warcraft last night, but I also woke up at 5 a.m. to put on makeup and to film this before anyone else woke up. That is how committed I am to both you and procrastinating. When all of the edges were trimmed, the pieces were pressed once again just to make sure there weren't any wrinkles in any of the layers. And then I started sewing them together, and I didn't film pinning them together because I honestly didn't pin a lot of them together. None of these fabrics shift around very much, and most of these seams were straight, so I could just line them up and then sew them. And the vast majority were sewn with a 3/4 inch allowance. This way I could take it in by a 1/4 inch without the seams being too bulky, but I could also let it out by a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch at each seam without the seam allowance being too small. With everything sewn together, I then realized, crap, you were going to add boning to the inner lining before you sewed all the layers together. So usually I would do this to the canvasy layer before I flatline it and add the outer layer of fashion fabric and baste everything together. But I completely forgot this time, so instead I'm sewing my boning channels into the lining layer of the fabric, which is another layer of quilting cotton. So here you can just see some marks that I've made with Sharpies. I made sure these were symmetrical on the pieces. And then I just stitched twill tape along that edge, stitching down both sides of it to create a channel. After this was done and all of the boning casing was pressed, I could seam these pieces together just like I had for the bodice. So then I had bodice made out of the layer of chiffon, the layer of quilting cotton, and the layer of canvas inner lining. And I had another layer that was identical in terms of dimensions that was just made out of the quilting cotton. I matched out the neckline of these two pieces with the right sides facing each other, and then I stitched a 1/2 inch away from it, from the center back to the other center back, and making sure that it met in a point at the front because I wanted there to be a point there. In film it, I did end up understitching this edge, which is basically just when you turn the seam allowance over to the side that you want to be turned inward, then you stitch very close to the seam point, securing the seam allowance to that side. So this just encourages it to turn inward smoothly, and it did. It looked really, really good. I actually have a picture of it on the dress form here, and this is after I added sleeves, but you can see how nice and smooth that neckline is. So I was very, very happy with this. Speaking of the sleeves, these were made from a sort of rectangular-ish shaped piece of cotton, as well as a rectangular piece of chiffon, and I actually cut the chiffon to be much wider than the sleeve itself was. Here you can see me kind of fiddling around with a ruler, and that's because I'm trying to figure out how much poof I want the sleeves to have, which is created by cutting that overlay to be longer than the lining. With that decided, I could mark out the width I needed and cut out a strip that was that width. Then I went over to the sewing machine and, starting about 2 inches away from each end of the pieces, I gathered them down to about 1/3 of their original length. So if these started out being 45 inches long, then they ended being 15 inches long. Here you can see my strip that has been gathered down on either edge, and I'm just going to go ahead and line up one of those edges with the bottom edge of the cotton layer, then just stitching those two together 3/4 of an inch away from the edge. Now the top edge of the overlay is a rectangle, and the top edge of the cotton layer is curved to match the sleeve head. The length for the overlay is only appropriate in the very center where the cotton layer is the widest. So I pinned that first, and then I pinned outward from that point, sort of draping the chiffon overlay in a way that I thought was visually pleasing. Then I stitched around the top edge of the cotton layer, and the excess chiffon can just be cut off. And this is a little scary because you're doing it by eye and you don't know if they're going to be symmetrical, so you just have to have confidence in your ability to fake it. Now the bottom edge of these isn't going to be hemmed using a traditional method, it's going to be finished with binding, and this binding is made out of bias cut strips of the same fabric. So one edge was folded inward by a 1/2 inch, and then the other edge was seamed on. It was folded over top of the seam allowance, and then the other side of the bias binding was stitched down on the underside. I did all of this by machine because I was planning on covering all of this stitching with trim. Here you can even see me pinning that trim on, but I just thought it looked too clunky and kind of tacky, which is funny because this is like a very nice vintage trim, whereas everything else was purchased at a craft store. But it just seemed really out of place on this project. So I took it off and decided to leave the sleeves plain. This means there is some visible top stitching, but the thread match was really good, so it's not super noticeable. Now I want to add a ruffle because, of course, I want to add a ruffle. As you'll see later on, the underskirt had these green ruffles, and I really want to incorporate that color and that material into the bodice. And since it is a relatively sheer, sort of difficult to work with fabric, I feel like it's best utilized as a ruffle. Though to be honest, I feel like most fabrics are best utilized as a ruffle because I really love ruffles. Anyway, I just cut out a 4-inch wide strip that was 3 times the length I needed, and then I folded the bottom edge inward by a 1/2 inch and I top stitched it down. I used more creative hemming methods for the ruffles on these skirts, but at this point I was sort of out of fabric that was required to do that. And also this is a mesh with sequins mounted on it, so it doesn't fray, and there isn't really any need to do additional finishing. Now the top edge can be gathered down, and I'm doing this just by pushing the fabric underneath the presser foot as I sew, and then stitching across it so it forms those little ruffles. And this is my preferred way of gathering. You'll see me do it throughout this entire video. It is not very precise, nor does it create the prettiest gathers, but when I have a lot of ruffles to make, it's my chosen method just because it is the fastest. Now here's another thing I definitely should have marked and pinned but didn't. I basically took that piece that had been gathered, and since it was sheer, I could see where it was placed away from the neckline, even when the edges of it were covering the neckline. You know, when I was sewing this, even though it's hard to see, that I was stitching about a 1/2 inch away from the top of the bodice. And this means once the ruffle is stitched on and flipped back so the right side is facing outward, There will be a border of a 1/2 inch of the bodice material around the top edge, which is what I wanted. I was not confident this was going to work, but it worked miraculously well. So then I went ahead and added the boning into the lining, which is just pre-tipped steel bones. The top edge was sewed with a 3/4 inch allowance just to create a guideline for where to turn inward and also to prevent any of the bones from slipping out. Unfortunately, I broke not 1, not 2, but 3 needles in this process. And I think the swearing in that footage would be a little bit too explicit for this video, so I just edited it out. Now about 1/4 inch away from that line of stitching that secures the boning, I am sewing some grosgrain ribbon, which is going to serve as a bit of a waist stay, and also neatly finish off this bottom edge. The bottom edge of the bodice was folded up on the stitch line, and then I just pinned the grosgrain ribbon to the lining, and then I went through by hand and slip stitched this top edge to the lining so it's nicely finished. So now it's time to decorate the bodice, and I debated a lot about how I should trim it. I wasn't sure if I should add flowers all the way around the neckline or just on one side so it's asymmetrical like the skirt, which is what I ultimately decided to do, so it looked almost like a continuation of the diagonal garlands on the skirt. Now this garland is made out of chain link, which ended up being a huge blessing because it's a lot more flexible than garlands that are mounted on wire. For all the garlands on the skirt, I had them completely decorated before I sewed them on, but for the bodice, I want to be a bit more precise with where my stitching was placed, so I decided to sew it on before it had been decorated. So I'm just sewing on the plain poinsettia chain garland around one side of the neckline of the bodice. So I'm sewing through pretty much every chain link on this, just securing it in a single spot before moving on. So my stitches are still pretty far apart, but it ended up being very secure. Then I went through and took pine sprigs that I had decapitated from a pine garland. I'm not sure what word to use there. And I threaded these through the chain links, and then once they were halfway through, I twisted the ends together so they were relatively secure. And for smaller ones, which were actually branches that I'd cut in half, they were stuck halfway through, and then I put it all up with glue on the chain, and then I folded the other end over. So I'm using 2 different lengths of pine garland for this, and 2 different methods to secure them in place. And yes, one of them does involve hot glue, but hot glue is not the be-all, end-all evil thing that a lot of people think it is. I definitely feel like it has a place in costuming. It's just perhaps used too much in costuming. I should also mention the reason I did this after sewing on the garland is because I wasn't sure how bushy I wanted this garland to be since it was closer to the face. I wanted it to be a little bit more delicate, and I thought I'd be able to gauge how many branches to add much better after it had already been sewn on. And I'm really glad that I did that. I also decorated it after it had been sewn on, so here I'm just gluing some bubbles onto it. These are all plastic shatterproof ornaments. That's very important. With that done, I could do a fitting, and I did this just by turning the back edges inward, pinning them to a zipper, and then trying it on over top of my corset. And it was pretty successful, so here you can see me basting the back edges inward, and these are on an angle. I ended up having a lot more room at the top than the waist. So the waist is turned inward by about 3/4 of an inch, whereas the top is turned inward by almost 2 inches. After this was basted on, I prepared a zipper. I know what you're thinking. This is a Victorian dress, and you put this horrible looking separating zipper on the back of it that's very visible. Why would you do such a thing? I did such a thing because the skirt for this is so bulky and so heavy, I wasn't sure I'd be able to wear it in the car. And if I had to get dressed at a Christmas tree farm, I didn't want to be fiddling with 20 hooks down the back of this bodice. I wanted to be able to just zip it up and go. The reason it ended up being so visible as opposed to being hidden underneath the layers of fabric is because the outer layer of this is chiffon and the ruffle is a mesh, and both of those are relatively fine fabrics that easily get caught in the teeth of the zipper. And if they got caught in the teeth of the zipper either jams or it tears the fabric because it's a pretty heavy duty metal zipper. And I didn't want either of those things to happen, especially if I choose to alter this bodice in the future so it does close with hooks and bars, in which case any damage to the center back edge is going to be really noticeable. So I just decided to embrace the green zipper I had on hand, and it is very visible in the finished costume, but honestly doesn't bother me that much. I mean, this is a dress decorated with things I bought from Michael's, so like, come on, be serious. Anyway, I just matched the top and bottom edges of the zipper up with the center back edges of the bodice, and then I stitched relatively close to the teeth. But as I said, not too close because I didn't want it to get caught in the fabric. So I did some work off camera yesterday and I just wanted to catch you up. I installed this little piece of grosgrain ribbon that has hooks on one side and eyes on the other. So this is going to function as a waist stay before the zipper is done up. I also just whip stitched loosely this back edge down, and then I used smaller slip stitches at the top and bottom to secure that so it looks nice from the front. So this is one side that has now been finished, and this is the side that has not been finished. So I have to tuck this down and get it sewn, and then remove all the basting stitches that just temporarily kept this edge folded inward. Off camera, I added a couple more flowers to the opposite shoulder of the bodice, just so it looked a little bit more balanced. And then after that, it was done. So now we can start on the underskirt for this. And with bustle dresses, it's especially important to work from the bottom layer outward. So for this one, there is a lobster tail bustle, which I actually have a video over on Patreon about making. Then there is a cotton petticoat, which I also have a video on Patreon about making. Then there's going to be this underskirt, and then there's going to be the overskirt. And you want to start with the underskirt first to make sure that the overskirt will fit nicely atop it. In this case, the underskirt is made out of stash fabric. The upper portion that won't be visible is cut out of the red silk. The bottom portion is going to serve as lining for the mesh ruffles and be quite visible. So I decided to make this out of the green, so it would be less noticeable beneath the green mesh. Here you can just see me cutting out the various pieces. And no, I did not iron the fabric before doing this. I don't know why. Yes, it is annoying to watch. It's annoying to me too, trust me. Anyway, the tops and bottoms of these pieces were seamed together to form the full-length pieces I need for the skirt. And I seamed the silk to the polyester taffeta horizontally with 1/2-inch seam allowances that were then trimmed and sewn again as French seams. And the front panels were sewn to the side panels with French seams. And then the side back panels were sewn to the back panels with French seams. And then guess what? The side back panels were sewn to the side panels, creating a skirt. And before sewing up the center back seam, I actually decided to stitch some horsehair braid around the join point between these two panels, just to give it a little bit more structural integrity. Horsehair braid is something I'm going to be using quite a lot in this video, and it's not actually made out of horsehair. It's a very stiff nylon mesh that is used to add volume to things. So this will just help keep its shape a little bit more smoothly over top of the petticoats, or at least that was my hope. I stitched up the center back seam, and I stitched pretty much all of it up except for the top 12 inches, which were left open to form a closure later on. And with that done, the hem was now continuous in a loop, so I could hem it. I did this with horsehair braid as well. So this is first sewn on with the right sides facing each other, about a 1/2 inch away from the hemline, with both the horsehair and the fabric edges level. After this was done, which took a long time because it's a very long hem, the horsehair braid is turned to the inside of the skirt, and there should be whatever seam allowance you used distance away from the hem, which is where you're going to sew again. So this is where the fabric meets the horsehair braid. And I feel like you can see what I'm talking about even if you can't understand what I'm talking about. Half the time I also can't understand what I'm talking about, and that's why I was given eyes. And now we move on to the most frustrating part of this costume and the biggest mistake that I made. I decided that I was going to bind the bottom edge of the mesh ruffles with red ribbon. And I thought this ribbon would be too stiff because it was wired, so I very cleverly removed all of the wire beforehand, which is what you can see me doing here. And then I cut out so many of these 12-inch long strips, which are going to serve as ruffles for the bottom edge of the underskirt. These are made from that sequin green mesh, and I did not even make this connection at the time, but thank you, Christine from Sewstein, for pointing out that this fabric kind of resembles garbage bags, because now that's all I can see. Before that, I thought it was super pretty and sparkly. Anyway, once all of those strips were cut out, and I think there were probably like 15 in total, I seamed them together and then trimmed away any excess seam allowance. So now I had one very, very, very long strip that could be bound and then gathered down for the hem of my skirt. So here you see me binding it, and I am doing this just by sewing the ribbon on with the right sides facing each other and a 1/2 inch allowance. Then the ribbon is going to be folded over the hem and under the hem and stitched from the back side to secure, creating a even 1/2 inch border of red ribbon around the bottom edge. And I was like, wow, this is gonna look amazing. This is brilliant. You're so smart. It's gonna be glittery. It's gonna be awesome. It was very glittery. It was not awesome. Even with the wire removed, this ribbon was really, really stiff. So it was almost like this very thin fabric had been hemmed with paper. So it wasn't even sticking up in like nice little arches. It was like sticking up in little peaks and triangles, and it looked terrible. So I decided I had to remove it. And removing this should have been done very slowly and carefully, but this was like 30 yards of ruffles. I'm not even exaggerating. And I did not have the patience nor the time to very carefully seam rip off this ribbon, nor did I have the extra seam allowance or fabric to cut the ribbon off. So I sort of did a mixture of the two things, using a seam ripper to sort of start removing the stitches securing this, and then I would just sort of rip at it. And this allowed me to accomplish the task in about an hour. Whereas I think doing this very, very carefully to avoid damaging the material probably would have taken days, and I'm not even exaggerating. This left the bottom edge perfectly fine in some places, but pretty tatty in others. And I couldn't just hem this to be shorter because I hadn't added a hem allowance. I was planning on binding this bottom edge. So I decided instead I would add a band of the silk chiffon. So I cut these strips from the bias, then I stitched them together, then I folded them in half so the folded edge would be at the hem. I lined up all of the raw edges and stitched them on with a 3/4 inch allowance. And since all of the ribbon was sewn onto the bottom ½ inch, the 3/4 inch allowance was enough to cover up any sort of issues or tears that I created in the material. When I cut these strips of chiffon, I cut them long enough to account for the length I would lose by seaming them on. So the skirt still ends up being the right length after they're stitched on. But now I was faced with another issue in that this was going to fray. Slightly. The chiffon frays a lot, but it's cut on the bias. I also decided to trim this edge with pinking shears, which will help prevent fraying. And then I turned the seam allowance up and I top stitched it down, so there is now a barrier of stitches that it will not fray past that point and become visible at the hemline of the skirt. So this isn't the most beautiful finish, but it's definitely a functional finish given what I was doing. And I didn't want to do a bulkier finish because you would potentially see it through the sheer fabric, or it would potentially stiffen the hemline enough that I would go back to where I was before and have the whole peaks and valleys type situation that just looked really bad. The chiffon and the top stitching and the trimming all worked beautifully, and this had a really, really nice drape once I tried pinning it on my underskirt, which I was just overjoyed about given all of the problems I'd had. So I went ahead and gathered the top edge down to 1/3 of its original length, once again using that pushing it under the sewing machine presser foot as you go method. And then I marked a chalk line about 11 inches away from the bottom edge of my underskirt, and I matched the top edge of the ruffles up with that. And the ruffles I think were a finished length of 12.5 inches long, so the bottom edge is going to extend past the edge of the underskirt, so it won't be visible. But you'll still see part of it because the material I'm using for ruffle is sheer, which is why it was so important that this portion of the underskirt was green. Here I'm doing something I also regret, which is just stitching horsehair braid over top of the seam allowance. The reason I regret this is because the overskirt didn't end up being as long as I thought it was going to be, so you ended up seeing this, and I had to cover it with bias cut strips of taffeta that were machine sewn on later on, which was a huge pain to do because at this point the underskirt was pretty heavy with its massive ruffle. The mesh doesn't fray, so this only offered the skirt structural integrity, which could have just as easily been done if I sewed it on the inside of the skirt and it wasn't visible from the exterior. This next footage was taken very late at night, but this is me finishing this underskirt. Here I'm just machine stitching bias binding around the opening of the underskirt, so sewing it on with the right sides facing each other, folding it over the edge, and then machine stitching the underside down as well. Sorry if I'm like looking off into space, it's because my dog's eating things. Which I'm not opposed to if it keeps her quiet, I just want to make sure it doesn't result in a trip to the vet later. Anyway, the waistband for this was made out of a 1 inch wide piece of band roll that was fused to a 3 inch wide piece of silk taffeta. And then I folded it in half and I stitched across the ends, the short ends I should specify, the like now 1.5 inch long ends once it was folded in half ends. And I just clipped excess bulk out of the corners. Then I stitched the front side of the waistband onto the top edge of the underskirt. The top edge of the underskirt, which is raw and fraying and gross, was tucked between the layers of the waistband, and then the other layer was folded inward and top stitched on top of it, neatly containing them. And this ended up closing with a hook and eye, which I sewed on about an hour before photographing this project, so no footage of that. Now here are some photos of the underskirt in this state, and you'll notice another little issue with this, and that is that you can see a large portion of the horsehair braid and underskirt when the overskirt is on this project. So I was planning on covering a lot of this with a ruffle that actually hung down from the overskirt, but it just didn't look very good for reasons I'll mention in the next clip, so I had to reevaluate and reassess.
Sorry for the sewing machine noise in the background, but somewhere along the way I measured things wrong and you ended up being able to see more of the underskirt than I expected. So I had to make the ruffle for the bottom of the overdress portion uneven, so it would be longer in the back to cover what needed to be covered and short in the front, and I just really don't like how it looks, how it's draping. I'm not happy with it, so I'm going to rip it off. I'm going to hem this guy independently, and then I'm actually going to sew this onto the underskirt directly, so I'll have more control over its positioning and how it lays over the existing ruffle. I think I'm also going to be covering up the horsehair braid that's visible on the exterior of the overskirt, because that is now visible because this doesn't go down as far as I thought it was going to be. So quite a few things to fix.
Because the ruffle hung so unevenly and just looked so sloppy when it was stitched onto the bottom of the overskirt, I ended up sewing it directly onto the underskirt an even 5 inches above the previous ruffle. And this looked really, really nice. I did run out of ruffle, so I had to sort of patch it at the back with a longer length that was left over from making the first ruffle. But it all turned out fine. And then all I really had to do was tack the skirt into position.
So pardon the horrible lighting, but with the skirt in its current state, a lot of the volume sort of wraps around to the front because the back panel is cut very wide. So what we want to do is contain that volume by gathering down the back panel, and then the front is level with the floor and the back is where all of that volume sits and makes it look really nice and full. So I have to gather across this point, and then I'm just going to sew this over top to secure those gathers in place. I just took some photos. I'm not saying that it actually looks bad this way at all. It's actually quite dramatic and lovely. But one thing I don't like about it is that you end up with this hem discrepancy where one piece looks like it's cut to be much longer than the other because you don't have that sort of gradual slope with the way it's folded over on itself. So that's one of the several things we're hoping to avoid by doing this.
With that done, the overskirt is done, and we now have 2 out of the 3.5 garments finished. So let's move on to the most complicated one by far, which is the overskirt, which has all of the garlands on it. So this was a pain in the butt to draft because it's asymmetrical. So basically I had to draft one side, then I had to turn that into a pattern, then I had to cut out both sides, then I had to draw the lines I wanted onto the skirt, as well as the lines where the garland would be. And then I had to make a new pattern, and I couldn't just make half the pattern because both halves were different. So it was just annoying to do, but I did get it done, and here you can see me cutting it out of the quilting cotton, which is going to serve as a base. I'm only cutting out one layer of each of these fabrics because it's asymmetrical, so each piece is different. Let me reiterate that that is annoying. When that was done, I pinned across the points where the garlands would be placed, and I peeled back the pattern tissue to where it was pinned. I just used a Sharpie to mark a line on the back side of the material. So this is how I marked all of those points where the garlands would be onto the fabric. And you'll see me transfer them to the right side later on. Now I just seamed those pieces together using 1-inch allowances. I originally was going to do this using French seams, but I decided it wasn't necessary. Instead, I would just sew it so the seam allowances were facing outward, and then they could be top stitched down, and they would be covered by the overlay. So the inside would stay looking nice and pretty. And construction of this was pretty straightforward. The most complicated part was the back panel, which had darts. And here you can also just see me sewing down some of the seam allowance to prevent it from flipping up underneath the overlay. Now I'm going to transfer all of those markings on the wrong side of the fabric to the right side using stitching. So I changed out my bobbin thread for white, so it would be very prominent and stark on the red fabric. And then I just stitched across those points from the wrong side of the material. And these created a stitch point on the front that I could follow. And this is really important because this marks where the sort of overlay begins and ends at each section. I also sewed up darts before doing this for the back panel, and then I sewed up the back seam and the side back seam, leaving a 12-inch or so gap in it, which is how I'm going to get it on and off. Now, I think the original dress was probably made using silk tulle or organza or something that has a lot of body to it, which chiffon does not. But I wanted to use this chiffon because I had it in my stash and because the color was so great. So to give it some support, I am also using organza underneath it. So I just tore these strips of organza in a similar color, and I stitched them together to form a very long strip, and then I gathered down the center of the strip. And if you notice a little piece of tape on my sewing machine, that is positioned 3.5 inches away from the needle, so I can stitch down the center of these 7-inch wide strips. So I didn't have to mark anything on the strip itself, I just had to keep one of the edges level with that washi tape. With this done, I could then sew these strips on to approximately the center point between the stitching lines, so where the chiffon poofiness needs to go. And after this was done, this is what my very, very sad skirt looks like. I did not have a lot of confidence at this point, I've got to say, because it looked really bad. But I put a lot of effort into this already, so I was gonna keep going. I cut out a bunch of chiffon bias cut strips, and I cut these in various different lengths. Now, before we go into this, I have to explain another annoying aspect of this dress. It gets longer towards the hem, but even if it was the same length at the back as at the front, it would have to be cut longer at the back to make it over the volume of the bustle. So whereas the front is straight, the back is curved, and that requires more fabric to go across. This meant I couldn't just make them all 10 inches wide. They wouldn't end up looking like the fashion plate. Instead, I had to carefully figure out how long they need to be in the back so they could be symmetrical, which I think was 10 inches apart at the front. The other thing I should mention is that this isn't tiers. I'm not making tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I'm making a spiral, which means it's continuous. So I really wasn't sure how to attempt this, but I just decided to go for it. So I used a ruler to figure out what I wanted the thinnest strips to be cut to. So these are the ones that are going to go on the front where the stitch points are 10 inches apart. And I think these strips were like 13 inches to account for floofiness. Then I gathered down both edges, much like I did with the sleeves earlier on. And I'm gathering these strips down to about 1/3 of their original length, which is typically what I like to do for gathers. Then I positioned one of the edges of the hemline and stitched it on. The top edge was arranged and pinned to sit just beyond the other stitch line that was parallel to it, and then this was sewn on as well. Where I could, I tried to sew it on with the right sides facing each other so then the panels could be flipped up and there'd be a finished edge as opposed to a raw one. But either way, this point is going to get covered with garland, so it's fine. And this worked phenomenally well. Here I'm doing one of the back panels, which was cut to be almost twice the width of the front panels. So what I ended up doing was much like you saw with the sleeves, how I just sort of pinned the top edge to match the curvature and then trimmed off the excess. That's what I'm doing here for all of these swoops and curves. So I cut out a piece that was wide enough to cover the largest gap, and then I would just pin and fiddle with and play with and trim off any excess that I needed. And in doing this, I didn't sew these strips together. I didn't do math ahead of time to figure out how long every portion of the strip needed to be and where it needed to match up. I just did these in rectangular panels by eye, and whenever I stitched a new panel on, I overlapped it by the other one by about 3 inches, and I folded the edge inward by about 2 inches, so there wasn't a raw edge visible. I don't know if this makes sense. It did not really make sense to do. I was working on this and just like praying that it turned out because it felt so sketchy. I have some photos of it coming together, so here you can see the bottom one, which was all the same width, so it was pretty easy. And then here you can see random gaps that I had. So these were the portions that were like between 10 inches and 20 inches. So I had to cut slightly longer, but not too long of strips for those. And then in the end, I just had these smaller sort of awkward gaps that I had to somehow fill. And again, this is a spiral. It is continuous. There are no endpoints. It just has to keep going. But I persevered, and eventually it miraculously looked like this. I cannot tell you how overjoyed I was by this. Like, we went from this to this in a day. It was a long day, but it was a day. So this is where I decided I didn't like the ruffle on the bottom, so I ripped it off and I decided to hem it with twill tape instead. So I'm just stitching one edge of twill tape onto the bottom edge of the skirt, and then it was folded inward at the point where it was gathered and whip stitched to the interior, which you can see me doing here. Now the top 12 inches of the side back seam that I left open were folded inward. They were stitched with 1-inch seam allowances, so there's enough to do a rolled 1/2-inch seam allowance, which is basically what I did, and then I just whip stitched down the folded edge. I do want to mention that I ended up with a large gap here where the skirt sort of gaped when it was on my dress form, and I ended up adding a modesty panel off camera to cover that, which was just a piece gathered down with elastic that was tacked to either side of the opening. Then I added a waistband to this, and as you can see, this is completely out of focus. But I'm using the same method I used for the underskirt, just with a slightly wider waistband. So the matching fabric was reinforced with band roll, then one side of the waistband was stitched on with a 1/2-inch allowance, then the seam allowance was folded underneath the waistband, the other edge of the waistband was folded inward and top stitched to cover it. And now it is time for the garlands, which, as I said, I made because I was very picky and couldn't find any that I liked. It didn't seem ridiculously overpriced. So I bought these floral chain garlands, and then I also bought these pine garlands, and I ended up disassembling the pine garlands, just pulling the branches out from the wire until I had them all separated. I'm not sure where the footage of me doing this for the garlands on the skirt went, but it was the same process for the headpiece, which is what you see here. So then I could just pass these through the chain links and either twist the ends together for the long ones or glue the ends together for the short ones. And that gave me a variety of lengths and a good amount of volume. I just add these wherever I felt it was needed until the garland reached optimal fullness. And after that was done, I went through and added ornaments and baubles and more pieces from disassembled garlands to these just to make them look more elaborate and fancy. My favorite garlands I saw by far at Michael's were ones that were made entirely out of ornaments, but I thought they were just too bulky and heavy for what I had in mind, so this was kind of my compromise. And I ended up using all 100 of the ornaments that I bought. Now, sewing this on was I don't want to say disaster, but it was a process. I used upholstery thread for this, which is very heavy duty thread, so it wouldn't break even if it got caught, but it got caught so much. This is just a very difficult thing to sew on. It was very heavy, it was at an awkward height on my table, and it was really awkward to film. So what I did film, I'm mostly out of frame for, so you really can't see anything. But it was a lot like the bodice. I just tried to go through every chain link or every other chain link and stitch it to the corresponding point on the skirt, which was either at the hemline or where 2 of the gathered pieces of fabric met. When I was doing this on my dress form, I was just pinning the garlands and they were way too heavy, so they were sagging and looking really uneven. And I was so worried about how this would look after they were sewn on, especially when it was such a pain in the butt to sew them on. But it looked so good after. I was just like overjoyed. It's really rare for something to come out better than I expected to, so I was very, very pleased. Because the garlands weren't continuous around the bodice, I decided to make a belt to sort of break it up a little bit and make it look more intentional. So this was just made from the mesh fabric, 3 60-inch long strips of it that were seamed together and then folded in half and seamed with the right sides facing each other. When it was turned right side out, I had a finished 2-inch long strip. I knotted the ends and then I added some decorations to them, which you'll see me make in a moment. And I also made a little brooch that I could pin onto the front of it. So I'm now making tassels for the tails of belt, and I'm doing this just by taking a length of gold ribbon. It's probably about 24 inches long, 30 inches long. And then I'm threading a bead onto the center and then just tying the 2 ends together to create a knot. So that bead is now in the center of the ribbon. And I repeat that several times. And then I'm going to take the 2 ends and work with them both together. I'm going to cut them so they're level and then thread them through a tapestry needle. And when the ribbon is threaded through that, I can then sort of disassemble my garland, which I'm using to make these tassels. So I'm going to put on the biggest ball first and just spear through its center. And then we're doing another gold bead. Then we're going to do this guy. We're going to do another gold bead, and then we're going to do one of these little ones. And then we're going to do another gold bead. And that's it. So now I can tie the top of this one off. And I'm just going to make another one that's identical to that, and then I'm going to make 2 that are a slightly shorter length and 2 that are slightly longer length, so there's variation in the tassels. And that is the story of making my most complicated Christmas costume ever. And I took myself and my giant vessel over to a Christmas tree farm and got these photos of it. So let me show you some of them. I am very, very pleased with how this turned out. There are some fit issues, I will admit that, especially in the bodice. It could be fitted better. You're getting some rippling at the back because it's too long-waisted. You're getting a little bit rippling at the sides. I wish I'd had more fabric left over so I could have gathered the sleeves more densely. Like, it's not perfect, but I think it is spectacular. I am so pleased with how the garlands kind of cinch it in a little bit and create that poofed effect that I wanted. I think the fabrics look amazing together. I think the spacing of everything looks really, really nice, which is something I was really worried about. It looks even where it's supposed to and asymmetrical where it's supposed to, and I just think the contrast of that is really, really interesting. How like the lines run parallel to each other, but they're asymmetrical. It's just cool. And I paired it with the same blonde wig I wore last year and a pair of long red gloves because they felt elegant and kept my hands warm when it was 20 degrees out. I should also say that I'm very impressed by how the skirt laid out. I think in pretty much all of the photos I laid it out myself, so it really did just drape very naturally in the train that I wanted, which I was pleased with. And because I know people are going to ask, here's a photo of me sitting in it. The bustle just collapses behind you, so you could sit on a stool or a backless chair of any sort. But you can in fact sit in it, and here is evidence of that. I would absolutely love to know your thoughts on this project. What do you think of it? Do you think it is tacky and obnoxious, or do you think it is sparkly and delicious? Or both? Personally, I think it was a really fun way to combine modern materials with a historical silhouette and costume, but I would love to know your thoughts, so leave them down below, and thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I will talk to all of you very soon, hopefully much sooner than it has been.
How am I supposed to focus on getting pictures when there are these cuties right here? They've been quite noisy. They're being quiet now, but they've been buying up a storm. Oh, they're so cute. So cute.